Well, it's said that the fairies of Ireland were, of course, Irish. No surprise there. And here in Ireland, we have a great tradition of absolutely hating our landlords. And we hate them even more now. And this is, let's say, a story from the biggest landlordification event in Irish history. It dates back to the plantations. Now, it's said that throughout history, most storytellers would have been something called shanachies. These were wandering storytellers. They traveled from town to town, village to village. They set themselves up in cottages like this one, and they would regale people with their tales. People would come from far and wide to listen to the shanachies' tales. Entire communities would be crammed into tiny little cottages just to hear them. But there is one person in that community you'd never find listening to the shanachie. The landlords. The greedy, thieving bastards. Now, of course, the landlords, who in this era, the era of the plantations, were mainly of English descent, they didn't particularly like the customs of the Irish. They thought we were all heathens, so they wouldn't think of listening to our stories. Nor would they consider listening to our warnings. They wouldn't think of listening to the silly Irish people, telling them where not to go, what places not to build their hand on. Now, it's said that in about the 17th century, a family came to Ireland by the name of the Johnstons. The Johnstons were a very, very wealthy family indeed. They had built themselves a gorgeous mansion upon a hill surrounded by alder trees. Now, they had the finest herd of cattle in all of Ireland. Milk flowed from their farm by the gallon. They wouldn't think of listening to the people telling them to leave out a cup of milk on their doorstep for the fairy folk. And what they didn't know is that the land on which they had built this lovely house was already owned. The good people, the other crowd, the good fairies beneath the earth, they'd laid claim to this land long before the ancestors of the Johnstons ever even came to Ireland. And now, in their fairy hill, they plotted their revenge. One evening, Mrs. Johnston, she was sat milking the cows as she did in the evening. And you know, she's milking the cow, and she's milking the cow. You know when you get that feeling that you're not quite alone? The pricking in the back of your neck that tells you that eyes are upon you? And Mrs. Johnston, she gets this feeling, and she turns around, and there, walking up the road to her, she sees a small little wretch of a woman, a shawl around her face, a hand outstretched as she strides forward. And the little woman, she spoke. My children are starved, and they'll soon be dead and buried and rotten in their own grave if they're not fed. But Mrs. Johnston, she looked down at this woman with scorn in her eyes. Why should you get from me what I and my family have worked so hard for? Why should you get that for free? And she slammed the door in the little woman's face. Now the next day, Mrs. Johnston, she's sat at the table, she's reading a letter. And you know that feeling when thunder is approaching, the stillness and heat in the air, the deathly silence of the birds. And she looked outside, for all at once she heard something interrupting the darkness, interrupting this silence. She heard a low, bawling, moaning sound, like multiple voices crying out in low, bawling agony. Now these voices, they joined together, and they weren't human, no, it was an animal braying, and they cried, and they cried, and grew louder and louder, and then there was silence. And Mrs. Johnston, she got up, and she went to the window. And there she saw them. The finest herd of cattle in all of Ireland. Dead on the ground. their mouths open, slack-jawed, blood pooling around, as if all at once their teeth had been ripped unseemly out of their faces. And with the last of the milk, she made some bread. She was kneading the dough, and she got that feeling again. Not quite alone. Please, madam, please! Some crumbs of that bread in the palm of me hands, my children, they're starving, madam! They'll soon be dead and rotten in their own grave. Oh, Mrs. Johnston, she picked this little woman up by the scruff of her neck. She dragged her down the road and threw her into the river. Now the Johnstons only had one child. Beautiful little thing. Most gorgeous, long golden hair. This child, he began to grow quite ill. He stopped sleeping. He stopped eating. And his eyes, they seemed always rimmed with red, staring out at nothing. And one day, he spoke. It's the fairies, Mother! The fairies! Every night, they drag me out of my bed. They bring me down to the hawthorn trees and they pin my hands up to those trees, and you know what they make me do? There among the trees. They make me dance. I dance their music. I can't stop no matter how hard I try. I dance until my feet are bloody and bruised, until I'm not dancing on my legs anymore, until I'm dancing on bloody stumps. And when that isn't enough, but when I can't dance anymore, they drag me back to my bed and they say that if I fall asleep, if I close my eyes for more than a moment, they'll heap stones upon my chest until I can no longer breathe, until I'm dead and buried in my own grave. And the child asked that bread and milk be left out to appease the fairies. But Mr. Johnson wasn't impressed by all this carry-on. Such heathen savagery is beneath us, child, he said. I won't listen to the delusions of some child compromising our good morals. So nothing was done. For a time, it seemed like the child was even getting better. And one night, he drifted sullenly off to sleep. And Mrs. Johnston, she looked over to him. Now his eyes were wide, staring out at nothing. I told you what they do, Mother. I told you what they do if you didn't listen to their warnings. She went over to her child's bed, for she could hear now strange, dripping sounds. She pulled back the covers, not believing what she was seeing, for there, beneath the covers, she saw not legs, but bloodied, hardened stumps where the legs should have been, flesh and blood, clotted, bone shards. And they buried the child the next day. Maddened with grief, well, Mr. Johnston didn't last that long after. And now, without her husband and her heir, well, Mrs. Johnston, she could no longer afford to keep her family in such luxury. So she didn't have any money to repair the roof when it caved in, to repair the windows when they were battered out, to stop the bricks from falling. She was forced to leave. And as she left, a ragged shawl around her body, she saw them there. The fairy folk, dancing upon the land they'd owned before and now owned once again. Mrs. Johnston had never shown anyone a day's kindness in her life. No kindness was shown to her in return. No cup of milk for her, no crumbs of bread in the palm of her hand. Just a ragged shawl around her body. She walked and walked and walked. And now it's time to carry on. See the sheep up on their hind legs dancing river dance. She'd crawl towards her neighbours, the other cheats
see his way.